Captain James Hartwell could smell the oil before he saw the plane. It was the scent of a machine that was already sweating from the effort of existing. He stepped out onto the damp English tarmac, 26 years old and already tired, staring at the shape waiting in the fog like a bad omen wrapped in aluminum. It wasn't just another flying fortress, it was heavier, uglier, and meaner, looking like a B-17 that had been hitting the gym and taking steroids. This was a fortress built for war inside war, 16 guns, 11,000 rounds of ammunition, and 0 bombs. A bomber turned into a gunship, a concept so American it should have come with a side of apple pie. The men called it the flying destroyer, but Hartwell just called it trouble, because he knew physics better than the generals did. Engines coughed awake, spitting smoke into the cold morning air as rain slid across the aluminum skin like nervous sweat. The crew climbed aboard one by one, gunners, engineers, and radiomen, each carrying the same quiet thought: this thing is going to kill us before the Germans do. They didn't dare speak it aloud. No one had ever flown a machine like this before, mainly because it defied the laws of aerodynamics. 4,000 extra pounds of armor and ammunition meant slower climbs, longer takeoffs, and burning fuel like a bonfire. Hartwell rubbed his hands on his flight jacket, trying to warm them against the chill of impending doom. "She's too heavy to come home easy," he whispered, a sentence that would become the unofficial motto of the entire program. It was May 29, 1943, and the war over Europe had turned into a steel storm where the forecast was always cloudy with a chance of flak. Every daylight bombing run felt like a coin toss between courage and death, and lately, the coin had been landing on its edge. That spring alone, the 8th Air Force had lost more than 170 bombers, a statistic that kept undertakers busy and generals awake. German fighters tore through returning formations like wolves in a sheep pen, picking off stragglers with brutal efficiency. Without long-range escorts, the fortresses flew back alone, engines shot out, wings burning, and men praying to a god who seemed to be on vacation. Half of them never reached English soil, crashing into the Channel or turning French fields into craters. So, someone in Washington had an idea, bold, desperate, and doomed from the start, like most good ideas in wartime. If fighters couldn't protect the bombers, then the bombers would protect each other, forming a flying porcupine of death. Engineers stripped a B-17 of its bombs and stuffed it with guns. Everywhere a man could stand, a machine gun would follow. No payload, no room for mercy, just wall-to-wall ammunition and a very bad attitude. It wasn't built to drop bombs anymore, it was built to kill anything that came close enough to say hello. They called it the YB-40, a flying fortress that didn't need an escort, at least that's what the brochure said. Hartwell didn't ask for this assignment, he had already survived 42 missions, which was statistically improbable enough. But he volunteered anyway, driven by the naive hope that maybe this crazy invention might keep his friends alive. The men who climbed aboard that day weren't chasing glory. Glory is for people who don't have to fly into a wall of lead. They were chasing survival, hoping that this heavy, clumsy beast was the answer to their prayers. At 1:25 p.m., the control tower cleared them for takeoff, and the YB-40, nicknamed Hedgehog, rumbled down the runway. It moved with the grace of a dump truck, engines straining under the weight of Washington's ambition. Behind Hedgehog, 168 standard flying fortresses followed, a silver river of thunder heading toward France to ruin someone's afternoon. Inside the cockpit, the intercom crackled with updates on engine temperatures, which were already running hotter than a stolen oven. Captain Hartwell nodded at the gauges, not trusting the comb for a second. He knew that in war, silence is just the universe holding its breath before it screams. By the time they reached the French coast, the sky had turned against them, filling with black blossoms of flak that looked like angry storm clouds made of shrapnel. The radio filled with static and clipped voices shouting bandits climbing from Rennes. The universal code for "we are about to have company." The crew tightened their harnesses as sweat mixed with the smell of oil and gunpowder. Training helps, but it doesn't prepare you for the smell of your own fear and recycled oxygen. 6 German fighters appeared out of the sun, diving straight at them like silver sharks sensing blood in the water. The nose turret of the YB-40 opened fire, sending tracers glowing like falling stars into the path of the attackers. For a heartbeat, the air lit up in orange, and the lead German fighter rolled away trailing smoke, surprised that the bomber was biting back. Cheers burst over the intercom. It worked. The fortress could fight back, and for 6 glorious minutes, the YB-40 became a wall of lead in the sky. But war never lets victory last long, and physics was about to file a formal complaint. Hartwell looked out and saw the rest of the formation pulling away, their outlines getting smaller and smaller against the horizon. You see, when a standard B-17 drops its bombs, it instantly becomes 6,000 pounds lighter, springing forward like a greyhound released from a trap. But the YB-40 carried guns, not bombs, and you can't drop your guns over the target unless you plan on throwing them at the enemy. Hartwell pushed the throttles to the limit, but the airspeed needle barely moved past 148 miles per hour. The standard bombers were already cruising at 160, leaving their protector choking on their exhaust fumes. They were alone, and in 1943, being alone over France was less of a tactical position and more of a suicide pact. The flight engineer's voice cracked over the headset, "Number 3 cylinder temps in the red." "Pull it back," Hartwell ordered, forcing them to slow down even more. The engines groaned like beasts chained to the air, refusing to carry the Washington-mandated weight. Fuel gauges fell faster than planned because dragging a flying tank across the sky is roughly as efficient as driving a Hummer with the parking brake on. No enemy fire had hit them yet, but the weight itself was killing them, dragging them down like a heavy stone tied to a swimmer. Then came the real attack. 3 Focke-Wulfs attacked from different angles, high, low, and dead ahead, realizing this straggler was an easy meal. "Hold your fire. Track right. Fire!" Hartwell shouted, and the sky exploded into a chaotic mess of noise and metal. Spent casings rained inside the fuselage like brass hail, clattering against the floorboards as 8 guns roared at once, turning the airframe into a trembling drum. A German fighter disintegrated in front of them, turning into a cloud of debris, but another one broke through the wall of lead. A 20mm shell tore through the right wing, severing a hydraulic line and spraying red fluid across the waist windows like an arterial spray. The gunner shouted, "We've lost hydraulics on the landing gear, which is pilot speak for, we are going to crash land." Nobody answered. They were 8 miles behind the main group now, watching their friends disappear into the safety of the distance. No escort, no cover, only the drone of their own struggling engines and the distant echo of death waiting ahead. Hartwell clenched the yoke, feeling the vibration of every bullet hole. The fortress built to protect others had become its own trap, a beautiful, armored mistake. By late afternoon, the YB-40s were no longer in escort formation. They were a trail of stragglers spread across the sky like breadcrumbs for hungry birds. 7 gunships had launched that morning, and by 4 p.m., every single one of them was trailing behind, proving that heavy and fast are mutually exclusive concepts. In war, distance is death measured in miles, and Hartwell was drowning in it until he spotted a familiar, clumsy shape below his wing. It was Captain Richard Hayes flying aircraft number 5741, his number 3 engine coughing black smoke like a chimney sweep with bronchitis. Hartwell's voice crackled over the radio, "Form up tight, Richard, 2 birds are harder to kill than 1. It was a nice sentiment, but they both knew that 2 flying bricks were still just bricks, gravity's favorite toy. Together, they limped west toward the English Channel, 2 steel giants bleeding fuel and dragging 4 tons of extra armor across a sky that wanted them dead. The Luftwaffe pilots had already figured out the secret of the YB-40. It wasn't a Predator, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. From above, the gunship looked bulkier and slower than the standard bombers, making it the perfect bait for any German pilot looking to pad his score. Why waste ammunition chasing a fast bomber when you can tear apart the slow, fat one that can't run away? 2 Messerschmitts dove from High 6, and the tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Raymond Kayak, screamed "Bandits closing" into the intercom. The sky filled with orange tracers again, slicing upward in a desperate attempt to create a wall between them and the inevitable. A 20mm shell tore through the tail section, and metal screamed as the aircraft shuddered violently, rattling the fillings in Hartwell's teeth. "Elevators jammed, sir." "Trim's gone," the engineer shouted, meaning the plane now had the handling characteristics of a dump truck with a flat tire. Hartwell fought the yoke, realizing he would have to muscle the 68,000-pound beast all the way home using sheer brute force. Fuel dwindled, engines overheated, and every vibration felt like the airframe was threatening to file for divorce. Then, just as the end seemed inevitable, salvation arrived. 4 P-47 Thunderbolts dropped from the sun like angry angels with painted noses. Sunlight flashed on their wings as they dove straight at the Messerschmitts, who decided they suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. The German fighters peeled away instantly, disappearing into the clouds, while the American escorts wagged their wings and formed a protective cradle around the cripples. No words were exchanged because none were needed. The escort plane had just been saved by the actual escorts. They reached England barely on fumes, the fuel gauges reading empty and good luck. The crew had to manually crank the landing gear down because the hydraulics had bled out over France, painting the fuselage red. When the wheels finally hit Alconbury's runway, the entire crew sat in silence, no cheers, no relief, just the heavy exhaustion of survival. Ground crews counted 16 bullet holes, a severed line, and one truth too heavy to ignore: the fortress built to protect others couldn't even save itself. Colonel William Reed met Hartwell on the tarmac, clipboard in hand, looking for data to send to Washington. He didn't ask about the men, he asked, how did she perform, hoping for a miracle to put in his report. Hartwell's answer became the program's obituary, a sentence that ended the dream faster than any German bullet could. He looked the colonel in the eye and said 3 words: "It can't keep up." The Army Air Forces tried to call it an anomaly, but the math was unforgiving: you can't out-engineer gravity with courage. The dream of the flying destroyer died right there on the wet English tarmac. The Army Air Forces did what any embarrassed institution does when faced with facts: they called it an anomaly and ordered everyone to try again. They assumed that maybe, just maybe, gravity had simply been in a bad mood that day and would cooperate next time. 7 more YB-40 missions followed in June, and the results were consistent enough to be a scientific law. On June 22, one gunship was shot down, and 10 others returned hours late, limping onto the runway like marathon runners who had decided to walk the last 10 miles. On June 28, 6 gunships flew, and all 6 were left alone over France for nearly an hour, circling like lost tourists in a bad neighborhood. One after another, the reports told the same depressing story: the gunship couldn't climb, couldn't chase, and barely managed to return. And yet, each crew climbed back in anyway because in the military, logic is subordinate to orders. By the 3rd mission, morale wasn't just slipping, it had jumped out the window without a parachute. Gunners began joking darkly that they were flying targets with a view, realizing their only purpose was to draw fire away from the planes that actually mattered. One gunner wrote in his diary, "Feels strange to hope for clouds, knowing that bad weather was the only armor that actually worked." They knew that if the Luftwaffe spotted them, there would be no help, no cover, and no chance. They were the slow kid in the game of tag. And still they flew, because someone in a nice office in Washington needed more data to prove their bad idea was actually good. At the maintenance depots back in England, engineers tore the gunships apart, searching for fixes with the desperation of men trying to defuse a bomb. They shifted ammunition racks, adjusted the center of gravity, and rewired power to the turrets, trying to find a magical configuration that defied mass. Nothing worked, because the math was unforgiving and brutally simple. A standard B-17 weighed 65,000 pounds on takeoff but dropped to 48,000 after releasing its bombs, becoming a nimble bird. The YB-40 took off at a crushing 68,000 pounds, and after combat, it still weighed 64,000 pounds because bullets are heavy and you can't drop your guns. It was an aerodynamic dead end: you can't out-engineer gravity with courage, no matter how many medals you pin on the pilot. When the final report came through in August 1943, General Karl Spaatz read it, sighed, and finally signed the death warrant for the program. 12 aircraft, 3 months of combat, and 1 dead dream. It was a bureaucratic failure of epic proportions. But for the men who flew it, it wasn't just an experiment, it was a promise that had turned into a burden. Hartwell would later say, "We thought we were building a guardian angel, instead, we built a coffin with wings." Yet, even in failure, the YB-40 left something behind, a spark inside the wreckage that would save more lives than anyone aboard could imagine. The story wasn't over, it was only beginning, because sometimes you have to build a disaster to find a miracle. When the YB-40s were finally grounded, the airfields fell quiet, and the hangars smelled of burnt oil and broken ambition. 12 gunships sat lined up under gray skies, their metal skins pitted and their gun barrels rusted black, looking like rejected toys. For most men, that's where the story would have ended, in a scrapyard surrounded by paperwork. But somewhere in Ohio, a group of engineers at Wright Field were reading the combat reports, and they saw something no one else did. They didn't see disaster, they saw data. Every malfunction, every bullet hole, and every desperate field modification told a story that was about to change the war. At Wright Field, the Army Air Force's Engineering Division dissected the YB-40 like a frog in biology class, going through it frame by frame and mission by mission. They didn't see a total disaster, they saw a goldmine of data hidden under a pile of bad decisions. That G might as well have stood for God help them, because it changed everything in the air war. Combat reports from late 1943 told a completely different story. Losses from frontal attacks dropped by more than 70%. Entire squadrons that once dreaded the head-on pass were now fighting back, filling the air ahead of them with a wall of lead. One pilot from the 91st Bomb Group said, "The Chin turret gave us teeth where we used to have only prayers." The innovation born from failure had begun to save lives, thousands of them, proving that the YB-40 wasn't a waste of time, it was just a very expensive prototype. The YB-40 was never celebrated, painted on posters, or remembered in museums, but every B-17G that thundered across the European sky carried its DNA. From 12 failed airframes came 8,680 successful successors, each one stronger, faster, and more lethal than the last. Each one owed its survival to a weapon designed by a ghost plane that couldn't even keep up with the formation. By VE Day in 1945, the B-17G had flown over 290,000 combat sorties, delivering ruin to the Reich with a reliability its predecessor never had. Historians estimate that the Chin turret alone prevented 2,300 bomber losses, which is a statistic that represents real human beings coming home. That's roughly 23,000 airmen who lived to see their families again, all because one failed gunship taught engineers exactly where to put two machine guns. But the YB-40's gifts didn't stop at the Chin, it kept on giving like a generous, clunky Santa Claus. Engineers also borrowed its staggered waist gun positions, allowing gunners to move freely without colliding mid-fight like slapstick comedians. They also copied its Cheyenne tail turret, giving tail gunners a wider field of view and more armor to hide behind. 3 features born in a plane that never worked would define the final, most successful model of the Flying Fortress. It was the ultimate irony, the plane that couldn't fly right taught the Air Force how to fly right. When Captain Hartwell returned to RAF Alconbury months later as a training officer, he found new crews gathering around their shiny B-17GS like kids around a new car. They pointed at the new Chin turret with curiosity, unaware that the device was bought with the sweat and terror of men who flew a plane that couldn't climb. One young bombardier asked, "Sir, is it true these came from that old escort experiment?" Hartwell smiled a tired smile, tracing the cold metal barrel with his gloved hand and replying, "Yeah, she couldn't keep up, but she kept us all alive." Not everyone was that lucky. Of the original 12 YB-40 crews, only half completed their rotations, which is a polite way of saying the other half died trying to prove a bad idea could work. Some went down over France, and some vanished into the indifferent sea, their names fading from the headlines faster than the smoke from their engines. But every time AB-17G returned home safe with its nose turret smoking, their ghosts rode with it, silent proof that failure still has value if you survive long enough to learn from it. Today, one of those legacies still stands in Dayton, Ohio, inside the National Museum of the United States Air Force. A restored B-17G, tail number 44 to 83514, named Shoo 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 Baby, sits polished under bright lights, looking like it just rolled off the assembly line. Visitors walk past the nose turret and read the plaque that calls it standard equipment, taking photos and moving on to the gift shop. No one mentions the YB-40, and no one remembers the crews who tested it, but their fingerprints are everywhere on that machine. History remembers victories, it carves their names into marble and prints their numbers into textbooks because we won is a much better story than we screwed up first. But the truth is quieter and much more painful. Progress doesn't come from perfection, it comes from people willing to fail. It comes from men willing to test what shouldn't work, to carry the extra weight, even when it breaks them and sends them spiraling into a French field. The YB-40 was one of those burdens, a necessary mistake in the evolution of air warfare. Every engineer, every pilot, and every soldier who ever risked something new owes a small debt to machines like this that sacrificed themselves for the data. They remind us that progress isn't born from success, but from the courage to look at a wreck and ask why, instead of just walking away. Because sometimes, the wreckage of one dream is the concrete foundation of another, stronger reality. The YB-40 was heavy, slow, and doomed a flying contradiction that defied physics and common sense. But from its broken wings came innovations that saved thousands. The Chin turret, the staggered guns, and the redesigned tail were the inheritance left by a dead relative. Hartwell once said to a young pilot, "The best teacher in war is the one that doesn't survive it," a sentence that should be engraved above every engineering school in the world. Today, aviation designers still study the YB-40 not as a success, but as an early lesson in the limits of power and the dangers of feature creep. It represents the stubborn hope that maybe one more gun or one more inch of armor could make a man invincible. It never did, but it taught us how to build smarter, not just stronger, proving that sometimes you have to be wrong before you can be right. Every innovation has a graveyard behind it, and every safe landing has a story written in blood that didn't make the history books. The YB-40's story is not about defeat, it is about transformation, how misplaced courage can eventually lead to something greater than the sum of its flaws. It couldn't keep up, but the world kept moving because it tried. If this story moved you, help us keep these memories alive by liking this video so more people can hear the names time forgot. Subscribe to the Yellow History as we rescue the stories buried beneath the victories, because every forgotten plane, every nameless crew, and every failed experiment deserves to be remembered.